Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and it's a privilege to be here today, and thank you for the trust. I hope that the next 1 hour of panel session, moderated by me, but with some very interesting, distinguished guests who will be introduced in a few minutes, will be interesting and valuable for all of you. But before inviting them on the stage, I would actually like to say a few words and set the scene, because the topic of the next panel is actually the role of government in the ESG space. What are they doing? Why is it important that they interact with business and so on? Actually, I would like to start with the topic of Sustainable Development Goals. Ever since they were introduced in 2015 as a blueprint to achieve a better and sustainable future for all, it was somehow the perception, especially in our region, our part of the world, that this is much more the business of government. Yeah? Because the topics which Sustainable Development Goals are covering, of course, are related to battling poverty, improving education and healthcare, social inclusion, as well as the climate change. And somehow, naturally, topics which are in the domain of government interventions, where governments provide policies, regulations, and so on. Then during the past few years, and we actually heard from the introductory speeches, we started speaking much more about environmental, social, and ESG frameworks and topics, and governance as well. So these were significantly boosted as well by the European Green Deal of 2020, were followed by a number of legislative changes that are introduced. We hear most of them coming from the European Union, but of course this is not unique. This is happening all over the world. And thematically, the ESG topic is broadly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Because the topics are kind of similar. We're talking about climate change, about social inclusion, governance, which is accountability and transparency, and so on. So what is the difference and why it is important to transition speaking about ESGs? Is it pure semantics? Is this another abbreviation that we're just using to attract attention and interest? Actually, the spread of the ESG as a framework has one very significant element, and is a step change, which we need to realize, and is very important. It finally brings the business actors to the table, because it finally recognizes that the corporate community have to have a shared responsibility to achieve the sustainable targets and goals. Because it's no longer the government's business only. By having requirements for investments, for reporting, for disclosure, actually these very institutions and corporate citizens who are creating value, who are impacting with their activity the climate, the natural resources, as well as all the people who are involved in their operations, need to be held accountable and need to be brought in this fight or in this change together with government actors. Change cannot happen only top-down. It needs to have daily activities in the form of business initiatives, in the form of transforming businesses towards the green agenda, if we are to report on certain progress in these areas. And of course, this will be the effect of all the European legislation that we've been hearing, some of it in draft, others already adopted. We're speaking about the EU taxonomy. We're talking about the newly adopted Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, the draft Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, as well as even specific country legislation, such as the recently adopted German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. These regulations will have direct impact on all the countries that choose and will transpose and adopt locally this legislation. But even more so, it will also have much bigger indirect impact even on companies who are not situated in those countries, just because the requirements there go across the whole value chain. If you are a client or a supplier or interact with any such company that is subject to such reporting and regulation, you're going to be impacted. And that is the beauty of it. It actually goes much beyond the specific legislation that has been adopted. So coming back to governments, we see that businesses are now on the table, they're involved. So what is the role of the governmental sector? It still has a hugely important role to play in ESG. I would argue mostly in 3 areas. Of course, first it's about government helping embracing, adopting, and implementing the right regulatory policies and frameworks at the national level in two directions: to stimulate action, for example, by green incentives, fiscal incentives for companies to be investing in green activities, or by actually imposing regulation to enhance the transparency and accountability, which is around reporting and disclosing important KPIs, which are related to ESG. So this is one role. Another role, and this may not be necessarily obvious, is actually that governments have a role to play to stimulate innovation, because there is no way that without strong investment and stimulus of green technologies and innovation, we will achieve the ambitious targets of how fast actually climate needs to be mitigated and how fast we actually need to adapt to the climate changes. So innovation is important there. We need to have the stimulus for companies, startups, and everyone in this scene to be fully supported to innovate, to develop new technologies, and governments have a role to play there. And finally, maybe most importantly, governments need to be leading by examples. At the end of the day, they themselves are large employers, large buyers of services and products. They are property owners. So they have the spending power to move the needle substantially on each of the ESG areas. And they should really be transparent to gain trust from society. So if they themselves act and behave like responsible corporate citizens, then they have the full right to require this from companies. Yeah? So if these are the areas where government intervenes and kind of has its role to play in the ESG space, so what are the typical actions that governments are taking? And we see a lot of this as examples across our wider region. So governments, first of all, raise awareness. They sustain a dialogue. They set coordination mechanisms between the private and the public sector to speak about the need of ESG transformation. Then, of course, they develop strategies at the national, at regional, local level and turn them into action plans with prioritized initiatives, actually going even down to creating the specific programs and projects, because this is the way to implement and to operationalize any strategies that otherwise may remain at the high level on paper. Governments also plan for the funding and financing of relevant programs, and particularly infrastructure investments, because we all know how big a change will need to happen in that space if we are to achieve our sustainability targets. And finally, governments do monitor and report the results, promoting accountability and transparency along the way in front of the whole society. And then finally, before I actually finish the initial introduction and we go into the discussion, let me point out also a few thematic examples of how governments intervene and interact. Actually, I tried to pick up a few from our closer region here on the three different pillars of ESG. What do they do? For example, if we start from the environmental area, the first subtopic, which is really important, and we see lots of activity there, this is the climate change mitigation, which is around decarbonizing and changing the energy consumption pattern as well as the energy mix. I don't need to tell you how important this is in light of recent developments. But we are actually encouraged by seeing a lot of activity in the neighboring countries and regions. For example, we're having the Romanian government who is currently developing its hydrogen strategy, something which is extremely innovative and very important. And it's a great example for a number of countries in the region. We had very recently in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian government structuring and finalizing the National Decarbonization Fund, whose sole purpose is to focus on the energy efficiency, because this is a huge issue because of the quality of the buildings and actually lack of refurbishment. And this nets any other proactive decarbonization efforts in the country. So this fund will be entirely focused on refurbishing and helping change the needle in the public sector as well as residential buildings. And finally, Bosnia and Herzegovina is also currently considering the development of a targeted financial instrument which will be focused on decarbonizing, enhancing renewable energy, enhancing energy efficiency, as well as fighting energy poverty. Another example in this space is the climate adaptation, because we know how important climate mitigation is this is something that we need to do if we are to decarbonize the economy and reach the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees change in climate going forward. However, unfortunately, some of the climate change is already here to stay. And we're seeing already the disasters and the impact on economies, on societies, on populations. This means that countries necessarily need to be thinking about investment not only in decarbonizing and climate mitigation effort, but adapting to the already existing climate change. We are seeing a number of countries, the most recent example I can think of is Serbia and Albania as well, who are developing, as we speak, their national climate adaptation plans with a focus on several important areas such as agriculture, forestry, energy, as well as water management. Finally, the circular economy, which is another third important pillar of the environmental aspect of ESG. It concerns the usage of resources, the waste generation and waste reuse, because that's the real sustainable way of achieving different pattern of consumption, which directly will impact decarbonization. I can think of a couple of examples. One of them is, again, Bosnia and Herzegovina, who last year completed their national circular economy roadmap, where there are a number of initiatives in which government, together with business, will be working to stimulate circular economy models in some of the selected priority sectors there. Let's move a little bit to the social area. In the social area, it's about a very wide range of subtopics. It's about working conditions, equal opportunities, social inclusion, health and safety, but also upskilling and reskilling in order for the green and digital agenda to happen properly. Some of the countries in the region, such as Bulgaria and Georgia, for example, have been working to improve and strengthen the vocational education training systems of the countries in order to reflect the evolving demands of business in different sectors. And that's the way to ensure that there will be exact meeting between supply of labor force with skills and demand from the business, of course. But some of the countries have been even more innovative. When we talk about social inclusion, for example, Slovenia is currently examining the possibility to introduce the innovative concept of social impact bonds, which are specific financial instruments targeted to fund and to support the economic entrepreneurship and inclusion of vulnerable social groups, such as women entrepreneurs, young uneducated citizens, and so on. And finally, in the governance area, it is all about transparency, accountability, risk management, and internal controls, but also responsible business practices. A number of countries and governments have been responding to this need to strengthen the area by introducing policies and legislation related to anti-corruption, whistleblowing, data protection. Some of them explicitly focus on their own examples of state-owned enterprises, such as Kosovo, for example, who is having an ongoing initiative to strengthen the state-owned policy and actually improve the publicly owned enterprises' corporate governance systems, as an example to the rest of the business in the country. So in summary, we see that the government and public sector have a very important role to play in the ESG space, and there are plenty of examples from across the region on what they have been doing. And more importantly, the examples are actually equally coming from EU member states as well as non-EU member states. So this is kind of a universally accepted role and something that we're happy to see and support.